Well, let's get started. First of all, thank you for coming. I know there's a lot of choices, and hopefully I will keep your attention. And I know we are probably all digesting our lunch, so hopefully I'll keep you from nodding off a little bit. My name is Monte Ratzlaff. I oversee IT security at UC Davis Health System. And today we're going to talk about evaluating security of new technology. And hopefully there we go. This is sort of the objectives of the presentation, to really understand the risks associated when you're either purchasing services or new technologies from vendors. We'll talk about the strategies to mitigate the risks associated with those technologies. And I'll go through the process that we use at the health system for that evaluation process, and hopefully this will be very interactive. There's a small group of us in here, so feel free to say, I have a question, or I have a suggestion, or this is how we do it, and we'll make this very interactive. So when we say technologies, what we mean by that is not just the brand new widget or just the brand new cloud service, but sometimes that means a new significant upgrade to a system, because those upgrades can bring new things, such as opening the firewall, or there's a new process, or we have to add more servers, whatnot. So that's why we also look at those types of changes. We're going to talk about getting plugged into the purchasing or the procurement process, which may be more challenging depending on which department or agency you work for. The actual evaluation process, as I said. And then when you do find issues, which if you're paying attention, you probably will find issues, how to work with the vendors to get them to remediate some of those issues, and then following up during and after the implementation. So as I said before, it's more than just a new thing that you're buying or installing. Sometimes it's a new service that you're sending data to a technology provider, like a web application provider that's either in the cloud or a software as a service. You want to look at their security controls. Even though you're not bringing anything into your environment, you are sending data to them, so you want to do your due diligence in making sure they're following best practices or meeting your requirements. In our environment, we have clinical devices, things that get plugged into the network that are inside of an exam room or a hospital room, a patient bedside, or surgical. There's lots of things that we have to also pay attention to when it comes to technologies that not everyone comes in contact with. And as I said, upgrades or material changes. So this sort of helps break down like why we care or what we see commonly. So if you will, just maybe help me imagine data as like eggs, okay? So we've got eggs, and we need to do something with those eggs or data. In this case, we need a place to store the data. So we've seen this before. This looks familiar to us, and this nest is used by 5 major universities, and customers include Fortune 500, and it's an industry leader nest. And all the buzzwords that you see when it comes to new technologies. 2 of our competitors are using this technology. These are what your business people are going to come to you with to say, I have a problem to solve, and I think this is how I want to solve it. So I want to buy this nest or this new technology to take care of my data. The problem is rarely when you read all those buzzwords, do you hear anything about the due diligence that went behind deciding to pick that technology. And so if you don't ask the question, what's the risk? Well, all it takes is one little match and that nest is toast. So you've got to pay attention. This is why we care. If you're not asking those kinds of questions, you're just buying something that somebody else has bought And then before you know it, all of their customers are at risk because nobody really asks those kinds of questions. So specifically, what are some of those risks? Well, who sees and uses the data that you're getting ready to send to that vendor? Do they perform background checks during their hiring process? You know, are there regulatory requirements that we didn't really think about regarding data retention? You know, if we get them our data and they have it, what happens to that data 5 years from now, 7 years from now? What about access, authentication, encryption, physical security? There's lots of domains of risk that we want to pay attention to. When you're talking about support, so it's not just security, but you know, does the technical support hours cover what you need as a business? So when in our process, we don't just have a security evaluation, we have an overall technology evaluation. Because when something goes wrong and it's a Sunday afternoon and you find out, oops, they don't really have support during those hours, you're stuck. That's not a good position to be in. You know, are they going to integrate into your existing databases or your applications? So you know, there's lots of things that we evaluate for here. Now, in our case, we needed to get in front of the purchase of the technology. Now, every agency or department is going to have a different challenge with this. You know, how do you evaluate before it gets purchased? So what we've done is we've created a policy for the health system that says, before our purchasing department issues a PO, and if it's for technology, they have to have sort of an approved by our CIO summary that says we've looked at it and we're okay with it, it's met all of our requirements. Now that's going to be a challenge for probably many of you in this room, is how do you get in front of that? Because as we all know, if you've been in technology for any length of time, what you end up getting is a phone call from a business unit saying, we just bought XYZ technology and we need you to install it next week. Is that a problem? You know, we hear that all the time. And so this is trying to get in front of that, not only from a support perspective, but also from the security perspective. And the community culture, so your business units, your departments, your divisions, your agencies, they have to get aware that there is this need to evaluate. So if you can't get plugged into that hard control that says we're not going to buy it until you've evaluated it, maybe you can get in through more of the awareness to say, if you buy this technology and we can't support it or it's insecure, it's sort of your risk now, and are you willing to accept that? Whereas if we can do some evaluation ahead of time before you buy that product, are we going to help you buy the right product? So it's not necessarily about being the police or saying no all the time. It's about doing the right thing ahead of time instead of after the fact. And we do this internally. So as an IT division, we run through this process for our own stuff too. So it's not just, oh, these are for those users. We actually use the same evaluation process for the things we're going to buy. This is a very high-level flow of how our process works. And I'll try not to get too much in the weeds here, but in essence, you can see that top sort of lane where the customers, they're the ones who are making the demands for new technology. And that request might come in through some of our liaisons that work directly with departments. It might come directly from purchasing. And when it comes in, we want to run it through sort of the process of saying, do we even need to do an evaluation? So for example, if a department's buying a technology we've already evaluated and it's just more of it, we don't really need to do another evaluation. Purchasing can go ahead and process that. Or if it's a technology that is one of those upgrades and it's sort of a gray area, we can kind of look at it as a committee and say, do we need to do an evaluation, or is this really just a sort of a .2 upgrade and we're fine with that? But if we do make a decision that we're going to do an evaluation, then it goes through sort of this checklist process. So we have checklists that we've developed that we return back to the customer, and we say, it's probably for you, customer, you're not really the person to answer these questions. It's really your vendor to answer these questions. And they'll return those questionnaires to their vendors. Vendors fill them out as best they can, and they come back, and we create sort of like a help desk ticket for all the groups that you see on the bottom to do their portion of the evaluation. which inevitably ends up with follow-up questions to the vendor. They either didn't understand the question or they didn't give enough information about what their answer was. So it's sort of an iterative process to say, okay, we've got the answers, we have some follow-ups, get those responses. And once each of those teams does their portion of the evaluation, there's an executive summary that gets created that sort of does, and I think I have a slide coming up, you can kind of see what it is, but it's almost like the stoplight version where it's, red, we should not buy this technology, yellow, we have some concerns and here's what they are, or green, we can fully support this technology. And that executive summary goes to our CIO, who then either can say, yes, I approve this, and the purchase can go forward, or no, we really should relook at what we're trying to solve here. So you can see there's 6 different teams within IT, as well as our clinical engineering, which is not really part of IT, it's in the hospital. And each one of those teams makes a decision, does this impact their group? Do I need to do my section, or can I say no evaluation required? So for example, one of those teams is our School of Medicine that also houses our application development folks. So if this has nothing to do with application development, it's sort of a black box, or it's a service provided outside of our walls, they probably will not do an evaluation. My team, the security evaluation, rarely gets to say, I don't need to do it. It's almost everything we buy, everything we do needs some sort of a security evaluation. So that's at a very high level of the process. Talked about the forms. We have our 2 checklists, the technology checklist, where I mentioned we talk about supportability. Those are the questions there. Security, I'll go in a little more depth in both of those. And so that technology one, I mentioned support, but there's, how does it integrate? What are the integration requirements? Those types of things. Reporting, the data types, any data transmissions, are we going to have to do some extract from a mainframe? We ask those types of questions before we get involved with the vendor. In all, there's 87 questions that look at all those various technology areas. That's not security, that's just technology. So for the security one, we ask, and these are just the high level sort of types of questions we ask. Obviously we want to know about backup security. If it's a vendor who's taking our data, they're in their own data center and they have offsite backups. Well, are those offsite backups getting encrypted before they leave the data center? What are the data flows? Are we sending PHI through regular FTP? Well, obviously that's a red flag and we want to address that. One of the things that tends to trip up most vendors is, and I think this will work, this source code vulnerability analysis. I can't tell you how many times vendors come back with either, I don't know what you're talking about, or they'll come back and say, all of our developers have been trained on proper code development. Well, that sounds nice. It sounds like, for business people, it gives them a little bit of warm and fuzzy. But I know that doesn't necessarily mean anything. I mean, I literally had a vendor maybe 2 months ago say, well, our code has been in production since 2008 and we've never had any problems. And it was a web application. Now, for those of us in the room who understand vulnerabilities, think of all the thousands of web vulnerabilities that have been out since 2008 and they haven't changed their code since then. That to me is a huge red flag. It's a major problem. So that's a question that if you start in your process and you ask about, either static code analysis or runtime analysis, some sort of a vulnerability analysis of their code, you will be surprised at how many companies do not do that. Now, that type of a process has been around for years. This isn't something new to look at your code to determine whether or not you have SQL injection issues, cross-site scripting, other exploitations. It's not new, but they just haven't done it because their customers haven't demanded it. So as we as a community start demanding this, trust me, they will start doing it because they don't like to say, no, we haven't met your requirements. They like to say yes, but nobody's ever asked them that. So that's one I see a lot. The data at rest, security, there again, if we're sending PHI, PII to a vendor and they're going to store it on their database, can they put encryption on either a field like a social security number or a driver's license number, or can they encrypt the whole database? Those are questions that we want to know. The security questionnaire has 87 questions. I'm sorry, 65 questions. Went back a slide. And there's too many for me to go on and on and on, but I think these slides will be made available if you want to go through. And those are just the high-level areas that we look at. Before I move on, are there any questions so far? Does anybody have any thoughts? Okay. I want to keep this interactive, so if you do, go ahead and raise your hand at any time. Yeah?
Source code vulnerability, who in the organization would do that? Would it be the security folks or the developers?
So the question is this, the source code vulnerability analysis, who in the organization would do that? Typically, the security, in a vendor situation, the security people would assist with the developers, but typically it's a tool that developers learn how to use on their own, but the security people need to be involved with it. There are tools out there. I think HP used to be called Fortify, and I think HP bought it. And they literally will take the source code, they'll do their analysis, and they'll come back with a report that says, we found these 5 vulnerabilities, and here's how you can fix them in your code. So the developers usually will run their process as part of their SDLC, but the security people typically want to see, are you doing it? And they'll probably advise on how to do it. But yeah, good question. Yeah.
You're not doing any security source code analysis yourself.
We are not. Rarely does the vendor. Yeah, exactly. The question is, where are we doing the source code vulnerability analysis? No. We have tools that do that, and any application code that we write as an organization, we run it through our own tool. But we rarely get the source code from the vendor in the first place to do that kind of analysis. Now, applications that we've purchased in the past where we weren't asking these questions, we can run other assessments against those in a running code environment, but we rarely get access to the source code. But that's why we ask the vendor to do it, because it's their IP, sorry. So this is that sort of green, yellow, red light approach that we talked about. And this is just going to lead us into the next one. I already mentioned the summary that the CIO looks at, and then finally the customer's notified if it's been approved for purchase. So this is the technology remediation. So the example I gave is the vulnerability analysis, and that's just one. So when we see something that either we can't support or it's insecure, we try to work with the vendor to see if they can remediate those issues. Because most of the time the business says, I really, really need this technology. And you're telling me I can't buy it because it's insecure. Well, let's try to work with the vendor to see if they can make it secure. Inadequate backup security is another one I mentioned, and that may be where they can't afford because they have not invested in encryption of their backups. So you look at other compensating controls. Inadequate security architecture. So they have a firewall. Well, great, that's nice, but how do you protect data from leaving your organization? How do you protect from malware getting onto that application or that website? Weak role-based access. So you may already know of applications in your environment where everybody's an administrator. Well, that's not a good model, and we don't want to buy technology that still has that model. We want to buy technology that says, if you only need to read reports, that's all you can do. If you only need to input data but not generate reports, that's all you should be able to do. So it's that least privilege access. We want to make sure that that's baked into the applications that we're buying. Data integrity, there again, making sure that, especially with PHI, medical data, that if we send data to a vendor, it doesn't get modified, it doesn't get changed while it's in their possession. And then if it's an outsource data center, do they have an SSA 16? If so, can we see it? Can we review that? That's sometimes our only way to determine if they actually have security at their data center. And when we do find these things, we want to make sure that the business owner, the person who is asking to buy the technology or the service, is made aware when we do find a concern so that they can help us work with the vendor. A lot of times the vendors don't really care that IT is sending them an email or making a phone call because we're not their customer. So if we're keeping our customer, our internal customer, part of the process, it helps us keep that communication line open with the vendor because they do care about their customer and they want to sell the service or the technology. Like I mentioned with the vulnerability analysis, when you do start to tell them we found these issues, you'll be surprised how many times you might actually be asked how to fix those issues. You're not the vendor, they are. They should know this stuff, but trust me, a lot of them don't. The vulnerability analysis, you ask the question, who should do that? If you're a vendor and you create software to sell, you would think you would already know that, but they don't. That's just one of the questions that we hear from vendors is, well, you've identified this issue, but how do we solve it? So oftentimes myself and my team have to walk through this with the vendor. Well, this is what we need you to do. These are some technologies that might help you. These are some processes that might help you. And if they do say we're going to fix these things before we buy their technology, we always get an email from them, something in writing that says, yes, we will do that. Here's our estimated completion date. Something that says they're actually going to take action. Because a phone call and them making all kinds of promises over the phone is really not going to help you. You need something in writing. Because if they don't do it, and a year later there's a breach or there's a problem, you can say you didn't do these things and you said you would, and now the lawyers are very happy. And then finally, if you're successful getting that remediation going, you want to keep your customer, your internal customer, in the loop. So this is the follow-up step. Before, so you've gone through your evaluation, you've identified some issues. Maybe they're not necessarily vulnerabilities, but maybe they're just things that you've seen that there's two options. One is more secure than the other. So you make a recommendation. Let's make sure we use, let's say, private key authentication for an SSH, okay, instead of a password authentication. So you want to follow, make sure, did they actually do the keys instead of the password? That's just an example. During the implementation, you might be part of the project team that you're sort of listening in on the meetings, you're making sure things are going well. So this takes resources, this takes time. But really our goal here is to be proactive instead of reactive. We're trying to get ahead of the problem instead of being behind the problem, like we sometimes can't help, but we're in that position. And then if you can, test those things that you've recommended. Make sure that they actually did what they said they're going to do. So I've kind of gone through this maybe a little too quickly, I'm not sure. But in summary here, I think we all understand the need for evaluation. If you don't have a process in place to evaluate, that's sometimes a challenge to get ingrained into your culture, to get people to pay attention, to care about evaluating. But you don't have to start with everything. Maybe just start with the big projects if you've never done this before. Start with the big technologies. The things that are going to involve protected data, for example. Sometimes I get questions from people saying, well, we're not really going to send PHI. Do you really have to evaluate it? Well, the answer is probably yes, because if you've been paying attention at all the last couple of days, you see that a lot of malware is coming in through websites, coming in through phishing, things like that. Well, if the vendor doesn't have good security controls, and all you're doing is going to one of their websites to gather information. If that website's compromised because they have poor security, now you're compromised. So you still have to pay attention to applications, even if they don't necessarily store protected data, because you're potentially opening up a lot of your internal customers to a website or a web application that could bring in bad stuff to your environment. The process, like I said, you might want to start small. It might be different than ours because your environment's different, your culture's different. But I think you've got to have something. You've got to have something there if you really want to keep bad technology. Maybe not necessarily insecure technology. Sometimes it's just bad technology because you're solving two problems the wrong way. We've seen examples where a department wants to go buy a project management software, and we already know that two other departments are using one that we've already vetted. So we can kind of help them say, you know, why don't you talk to these departments? They're already doing what you need to do, and we're already paying for licenses. We can maybe save the organization some money. So there's other benefits, not just security, to looking at what you buy. Okay, so anything else? Well, thank you again for coming out this afternoon. I really appreciate it, and I'll stick around for a few more minutes if you have questions, or if you would like me to send you any of the checklists or the other documents that we use, I'd be happy to. Thank you.